The villagers of Hollow Hill would never forget the night Thomas Ashford's hound returned without him. The massive black Mastiff appeared at the village square just after midnight on October 31st, 1847, covered in blood that wasn't his own, dragging something in his jaws that made grown men turn away in horror. It was Thomas's coat, shredded beyond recognition, soaked in blood and bearing claw marks no earthly beast could have made. The hound, whom Thomas had named Keeper, sat beneath the village clock and howled a sound so mournful, so utterly broken, that every dog in Hollow Hill joined the chorus until the night itself seemed to weep. When the constable approached, Keeper dropped the coat at his feet and looked up with eyes that held a very human grief. Then the hound did something that would haunt the constable for the rest of his days. Keeper turned toward Ashford Manor on the hill, toward the place the villagers whispered about but never visited after dark, and he spoke. Not a bark, not a growl, but a single word in a voice like grinding stone: evil. The constable stumbled backward, crossed himself, and watched as the hound bounded back toward the manor, back toward whatever horror had taken his master. That was 3 days ago. Since then, 17 men have gone to Ashford Manor to discover what happened to Thomas Ashford. Not one has returned. But Keeper remains, standing guard at the manor gates, waiting for someone brave enough to help him finish what his master started. Waiting to tell someone the truth about what lurks in Hollow Hill. And tonight, as the full moon rises over the village, someone finally arrives who might listen. The bond between man and beast. Thomas Ashford had never intended to become a country gentleman. Born the third son of minor nobility in London, he'd spent his youth expecting nothing more than a commission in the army, or perhaps a position in the church. But when his 2 elder brothers died within a year of each other, one from fever, one from a riding accident, Thomas found himself, at 28 years of age, the inheritor of Ashford Manor and the estates surrounding the village of Hollow Hill in the Yorkshire moors. He arrived in the autumn of 1845, traveling by coach through countryside that grew increasingly wild and desolate as the miles passed. The moors stretched endlessly in every direction, covered in purple heather and gray stone, beautiful in their harsh way but utterly unforgiving. The village of Hollow Hill itself sat in a valley between 2 rising hills, a collection of stone cottages and shops that seemed to huddle together against the wind that never stopped blowing across the moors. Ashford Manor stood on the eastern hill, a sprawling estate built in the previous century, all dark stone and narrow windows that looked down on the village like watchful eyes. Thomas's first sight of it filled him with an inexplicable dread, a feeling he couldn't name but couldn't shake. The manor looked wrong somehow, though he couldn't say why. The proportions were correct, the architecture sound, but something about it made his skin crawl. His housekeeper, Mrs. Holloway, met him at the door with a curtsy and a warning. She was a stern woman in her 50s, local to Hollow Hill, and she spoke with the blunt honesty of the Yorkshire folk. She told Thomas that Ashford Manor had a reputation, that the previous owners had experienced troubles she wouldn't detail, that some rooms were kept locked for good reason. Thomas, who considered himself a rational man, a product of modern enlightenment, dismissed her concerns as country superstition. He'd encountered plenty of that during his journey north, but that first night, lying in his bed in the master's chamber, Thomas heard sounds that made him reconsider his dismissal. Footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening and closing though he'd watched Mrs. Holloway lock them, and underneath it all, a sound like breathing, like something vast and patient waiting in the walls themselves. He told himself it was the wind, the settling of an old house, his imagination fueled by Mrs. Holloway's warnings. But he didn't sleep well that night, or the next, or the next. By the end of his first week at Ashford Manor, Thomas was exhausted and on edge. He'd taken to walking the moors during the day, both to inspect his lands and to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the house. It was on one of these walks that he encountered the dog that would change everything. The beast appeared from behind a standing stone, massive and black as midnight, with a head the size of a small barrel and teeth that could crush bone. Thomas froze, certain he was about to be mauled, but the dog simply sat and regarded him with intelligent brown eyes. It wore no collar, showed no signs of ownership, and was clearly half wild. Thomas should have been terrified. Instead, he felt an instant connection, a recognition of something in the animal's gaze that mirrored his own loneliness. He spoke to the dog, quietly, extending his hand slowly. The beast sniffed it, then pressed his massive head against Thomas's palm. Thomas laughed with delight and surprise. He asked the dog where he'd come from, whether he had a home. The dog simply looked at him with what Thomas could have sworn was understanding. When Thomas returned to the manor that evening, the dog followed. Mrs. Holloway was horrified, insisting that the creature was one of the wild moorland dogs, dangerous and untrustworthy. But Thomas had made up his mind. He named the dog Keeper, had a collar made in the village, and claimed him as his own. For the first time since arriving at Ashford Manor, Thomas felt like he wasn't alone. Keeper proved to be an extraordinary animal. He was protective but not aggressive, intelligent beyond any dog Thomas had known, and utterly devoted to his new master. More than that, Keeper seemed to sense something about the manor that Thomas couldn't. The dog refused to enter certain rooms. He would growl at empty doorways. He would position himself between Thomas and particular areas of the house as if standing guard. Thomas began to trust Keeper's instincts. If the dog wouldn't enter a room, Thomas avoided it. If Keeper growled at a doorway, Thomas took a different route. The servants noticed and whispered among themselves, but Thomas didn't care. With Keeper at his side, the manor felt less oppressive. The strange sounds continued, but Keeper's presence made them bearable. Winter came to Hollow Hill with brutal force. Snow covered the moors, and the village became isolated, cut off from the outside world for weeks at a time. Thomas spent his days managing the estate, reading in his library, and walking with Keeper when the weather permitted. He grew to love the harsh beauty of the moors, the proud independence of the local people, and the simple rhythm of country life. But he also grew increasingly aware that something was fundamentally wrong with Ashford Manor. It wasn't just the sounds or the atmosphere. It was the way servants refused to work in certain areas. It was the locked room on the 3rd floor that Mrs. Holloway insisted must never be opened. It was the way the local priest crossed himself when he visited and left as quickly as politeness allowed. It was the records Thomas found in his predecessor's papers, vague references to troubles and incidents, and regrettable necessities. Thomas began his own investigation, much to Mrs. Holloway's distress. He explored the manor systematically, mapping its rooms, examining its architecture, searching for evidence of what exactly had happened here. Keeper accompanied him on these explorations, always alert, always protective. The dog seemed to understand what Thomas was doing and approved. In the library, Thomas found a journal belonging to his great-grandfather, the man who'd built Ashford Manor. The entries started normally enough, discussing construction and design. But as the months progressed, the tone changed. His great-grandfather wrote about discoveries made during excavation, about finding something beneath the hill, about workers who refused to continue. He wrote about bringing in new workers who didn't know the local superstitions, about completing the manor despite the warnings. The final entry, dated 3 months before his great-grandfather's death, simply read, "It watches. It waits. God forgive me for what I've built here." Thomas felt ice water in his veins. He showed the journal to Mrs. Holloway, asked her what she knew. She finally told him the truth. Ashford Manor was built on Hollow Hill, a place the locals had considered cursed for centuries. The hill wasn't hollow in the sense of being empty. It was hollow because something lived beneath it, something old and terrible that the ancient people had sealed away with standing stones and iron and rituals Thomas's ancestors had foolishly ignored. Building the manor had broken the seals. Whatever was beneath the hill had been slowly waking ever since. 3 previous owners of Ashford Manor had died under mysterious circumstances. Workers had disappeared during renovations. Children from the village who'd played too close to the manor had vanished, never to be found. The villagers knew, they'd always known, but who would believe them? Who would listen to country superstitions over the word of landed gentry? Thomas asked why she hadn't told him this before. Mrs. Holloway said she'd tried to warn him, but men like Thomas never listened to warnings. They had to discover the truth themselves. She said she'd stayed because someone needed to maintain the house, to keep the worst of it contained, to honor the memory of the good people who died here. She said she'd prayed Thomas would be different, would be the one to finally end it. Thomas asked how one ended something like this. Mrs. Holloway said she didn't know. The old ways had been forgotten. The rituals and protections the ancient people had used were lost to time. All she knew was that the thing beneath the hill fed on fear and death. That It grew stronger with each victim, that it was patient in ways humans couldn't comprehend. That night, Thomas sat in his study with Keeper at his feet and made a decision. He could leave, sell the manor, let it become someone else's problem, or he could stay and fight. He thought about the children who'd disappeared, about the workers who'd died, about his own ancestors whose greed and arrogance had created this situation. He thought about the villagers who lived in fear of the hill, who avoided the manor, who lost loved ones to something they couldn't fight. He decided to stay. Keeper, as if sensing his decision, placed his massive head on Thomas's knee and looked up at him with absolute trust. Thomas stroked the dog's fur and promised that together they would find a way to end this. Spring came, and with it, Thomas's real investigation began. He corresponded with scholars and antiquarians, describing the situation in careful academic terms that hid the supernatural horror. He received books on local history, on pre-Christian rituals, on the folklore of the Moors. He studied everything he could find about sealing rituals, about binding ancient evils, about the old ways his ancestors had disrupted. Keeper remained his constant companion, and Thomas began to notice something extraordinary. The dog seemed to understand human speech with perfect clarity. When Thomas read aloud from his books, Keeper would react to specific passages, becoming agitated at mentions of certain rituals or symbols. When Thomas discussed his theories, Keeper would lead him to specific parts of the manor, as if showing him evidence. More than that, Thomas began to suspect that Keeper wasn't entirely a natural dog. The animal was too intelligent, too purposeful, too perfectly suited to fighting whatever lurked beneath Hollow Hill. Thomas wondered if perhaps the same ancient forces that had sealed the thing beneath the hill had also created a guardian, a watchful hound who would appear when needed. It seemed impossible, but everything about Ashford Manor was impossible. By summer, Thomas had formed a theory. The thing beneath Hollow Hill was some kind of ancient entity, possibly pre-human, that fed on negative emotions and death. His great-grandfather's construction had broken the original seals, allowing it to begin influencing the world above. The disappearances, the deaths, the atmosphere of dread, all of it fed the entity and strengthened it. If Thomas wanted to stop it, he needed to find the original sealing chamber and repair what his ancestors had broken. The problem was that the sealing chamber was somewhere beneath the manor, accessible only through passages his great-grandfather had deliberately sealed and hidden. Thomas spent weeks searching, tapping walls, examining foundations, looking for any sign of the entrance. Keeper helped, sniffing at floors and walls, pawing at specific stones. Together they finally found it, a sealed doorway in the cellar, hidden behind a false wall and covered with iron plates inscribed with symbols Thomas recognized from his research. Breaking the seal would be dangerous. The plates were there for a reason. But Thomas needed to reach the chamber beneath, needed to understand what he was fighting. He made careful preparations, armed himself with items his research suggested might offer protection: iron, salt, blessed watt, obtained from the village priest, and brought Keeper, who seemed eager to proceed. They broke through the seal on a summer evening just before sunset. The doorway revealed stairs descending into darkness, carved from the living rock of the hill itself. The air that emerged was cold despite the summer heat, and it smelled of earth and age and something else Thomas couldn't identify but that made his primal brain scream warnings. Thomas descended with a lantern in one hand, an iron poker in the other. Keeper went first, alert and protective, his growl a constant rumble. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling down into the hill, passing through chambers carved with symbols and warnings in languages Thomas didn't recognize. Some of the chambers contained bones, human bones, arranged in patterns that suggested ritual. Finally, they reached the bottom. The sealing chamber was a vast cavern, much larger than should have been possible beneath the hill. In the center was a pit, roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, descending into darkness so complete that Thomas's lantern couldn't penetrate it. Around the pit were 7 standing stones, covered in the same symbols Thomas had seen throughout his research, clearly part of the original sealing ritual. But 3 of the stones had fallen. 3 of the 7 seals were broken, and from the pit came a sound like breathing, like something immense and patient becoming aware of visitors. Keeper's growl intensified. The dog positioned himself between Thomas and the pit, hackles raised, every muscle tensed for attack. Thomas felt terror like he'd never known, a primal fear that transcended reason. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee this place and never return. But he forced himself to remain, to examine the chamber, to understand what he was seeing. The fallen stones hadn't simply toppled. They'd been deliberately pushed, their bases carved away, their foundations undermined. His great-grandfather had done this, had broken the seals intentionally. But why? What could possibly motivate someone to unleash this horror? Thomas found his answer in a small antechamber off the main cavern. There were bodies there, mummified by the dry cave air, and there were papers preserved in a metal box, covered in his great-grandfather's handwriting. Thomas read them by lantern light while Keeper stood guard, and he learned the terrible truth. His great-grandfather had been desperate. The family fortune was gone, squandered by poor investments and gambling debts. Ashford Manor was to be their salvation, a magnificent estate that would restore their status and attract a wealthy marriage for Thomas's grandfather. But they couldn't afford to build it. So when the excavation crew discovered the sealed chamber, and the foreman spoke of ancient legends about wishes granted to those who freed the thing beneath the hill, Thomas's great-grandfather had made a devil's bargain. He'd broken 3 of the 7 seals, just enough to wake the entity but not enough to free it completely. In exchange, the entity had granted his wish. Money flowed to the family through a series of seemingly fortunate coincidences. The manor was completed. Thomas's grandfather married well. The family prospered. But the cost came due with interest. The entity demanded payment in fear and death, feeding on the misery of every who entered its domain. And with each victim, with each death, the entity grew stronger, working slowly to break the remaining seals from within. Thomas understood now. His family's prosperity was built on horror. Every comfort he'd enjoyed, every privilege of his upbringing, was paid for with the lives of innocents. The guilt was crushing, but guilt wouldn't fix this. He needed to repair the seals, to finish what the ancient people had started, to imprison this thing forever before it broke free completely. The problem was that he had no idea how. The papers included no instructions, no ritual, no guidance. The ancient people who'd performed the original sealing were dead millennia ago. Their knowledge was lost. Thomas had iron and salt and blessed water, but no understanding of how to use them. He was an amateur facing a horror beyond comprehension, armed with nothing but good intentions and a faithful dog. As if sensing his despair, Keeper moved close and pressed against his leg. Thomas looked down at the dog and saw something in those brown eyes that gave him hope. Keeper knew. Somehow, the dog understood what needed to be done. Thomas just had to trust him. It returned to the surface as full darkness fell. Thomas was exhausted, terrified, and overwhelmed, but also determined. He would find a way. He would study, research, consult every expert he could find. He would repair the seals his ancestor had broken, no matter what it cost. But he'd underestimated the entity's awareness. That night, the sounds in the manor intensified. Doors slammed, windows shattered. Cold spots appeared in summer rooms, and the servants, terrified beyond endurance, began to flee. By morning, the manor was empty except for Thomas, Keeper, and Mrs. Holloway, who refused to leave despite her fear. The entity was reacting to Thomas's intrusion, to his discovery of the truth. It had remained passive while the owners of the manor lived in ignorant comfort, feeding on their fear without revealing itself. But now Thomas knew. Now he intended to fight, and the entity would not allow that. The attacks began subtly. Objects moved when Thomas wasn't looking. Shadows seemed to follow him. He heard whispers in empty rooms, voices speaking words he couldn't quite understand, but that filled him with dread. Keeper was constantly on guard, positioning himself between Thomas and whatever unseen threats stalked the manor. More than once, Thomas watched the dog snap at empty air and heard something shriek in pain or rage. Thomas worked feverishly, writing to scholars, conducting research, attempting to piece together a ritual that might repair the seals. He was racing against time, against the entity's growing strength, against his own exhaustion and fear. Keeper remained his anchor, the one constant in a world becoming increasingly unstable and terrifying. It was Keeper who ultimately provided the answer. One night, as Thomas sat surrounded by books and papers, the dog suddenly stood and walked to the library's far wall. He pawed at a specific spot, insistent and urgent. Thomas examined the area and discovered a hidden compartment, one he'd never noticed in all his searches. Inside was a single book, bound in leather so old it crumbled at his touch, written in Latin with annotations in Old English. The book was a grimoire, a manual of protective rituals and binding spells, compiled by monks in the 8th century who'd encountered similar entities across England. It contained detailed instructions for sealing ancient evils, for using iron and salt and blessed water and blood to create barriers such creatures couldn't cross. It contained exactly what Thomas needed, but it also contained a warning. Sealing rituals required sacrifice. The barrier needed power, needed life force to sustain it across centuries. The ancient people had used ritual sacrifice, offering lives to create the seals. The monks had found a different way, using the willing sacrifice of a holy person, someone who chose to give their life to protect others. Either way, sealing the entity would require death. Thomas read the book 3 times, hoping he'd misunderstood, hoping there was another way. There wasn't. Someone would have to die in the sealing chamber, would have to offer their life willingly, would have to become part of the seal itself. Without that sacrifice, any ritual Thomas performed would be temporary at best, lasting weeks or months before failing. He couldn't ask that of anyone. Mrs. Holloway was loyal but elderly, and not suited to such a task. The villagers were already terrified and wouldn't enter the manor. Thomas had no family nearby, no friends in Hollow Hill. There was no one he could ask to die for his ancestors' sins, except there was Keeper. And somehow, Thomas knew that this was why the dog had appeared, why he'd bonded to Thomas so completely, why he'd shown such intelligence and understanding. Keeper wasn't a natural dog. He was something else, something created or sent to fulfill a specific purpose. And that purpose was this, to be the sacrifice that would seal the entity forever. Thomas wept as he realized it. He'd grown to love Keeper more than he'd loved anything in his life. The dog was his companion, his protector, his friend. The thought of leading Keeper into that chamber to die was unbearable. But the alternative was worse. If the entity broke free, it would destroy Hollow Hill, would kill everyone in the village, would spread across the moors like a plague. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, would die. The entity had to be stopped, and Keeper was the only option. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat with Keeper, stroking the dog's massive head, memorizing every detail. He told Keeper that he was sorry, that he wished there was another way, that he'd give his own life if he could. But the grimoire was clear. The sacrifice had to be pure, untainted by the sins of those who'd broken the seals. Thomas's blood was cursed by his great-grandfather's greed. Only Keeper, innocent and loyal, could serve as the anchor for the seal. Keeper looked at him with those brown eyes, and Thomas could have sworn the dog understood everything. More than that, Keeper seemed accepting, even willing. The dog licked Thomas's hand once, a gesture of forgiveness and love, and then stood and walked to the door. It was time. Thomas gathered everything the grimoire required: iron filings to trace the binding circle, salt blessed by a priest to purify the chamber, water from a holy well to wash the stones, and his own blood to speak the words of binding and direct the sacrifice. He descended to the sealing chamber in the pre-dawn darkness of October 30th, 1847, with Keeper at his side and grief threatening to overwhelm him. This chamber was exactly as he'd left it, except the breathing from the pit had grown louder. The entity knew what was coming. It was preparing its own response. Thomas worked quickly, following the grimoire's instructions precisely. He traced the circle with iron. He purified the chamber with salt and water. He repaired 2 of the fallen stones, lifting them with strength born of desperation and positioning them exactly as they'd been before. The 3rd stone required the sacrifice. Thomas carved the binding symbols into its surface with a knife, mixing his blood with the stone dust as the ritual required. Then he placed Keeper at the stone's base and spoke the words of binding in Latin, his voice breaking with emotion. The entity screamed. The entire chamber shook. From the pit came a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow Thomas's lantern light, seemed to swallow reality itself. Shapes emerged from that darkness, tentacles or tendrils or limbs of some creature too vast and terrible to comprehend. They reached for Thomas, for Keeper, trying to stop the ritual before it could be completed. But Keeper lunged forward, intercepting the entity's attack, fighting with the courage of a guardian angel. The dog's jaws closed on darkness and ripped it apart. His claws tore at things that shouldn't exist, and with each strike the dog's own life force flowed into the stone, into the seal, creating the barrier the entity couldn't cross. Thomas continued the ritual through his tears, speaking the final words of binding, lifting the third stone, and positioning it with the others. 7 seals, 7 stones, forming a barrier around the pit. The entity's screams reached a crescendo, then cut off abruptly as the seal completed. The darkness retreated into the pit. The breathing stopped. The chamber went silent except for Thomas's ragged sobs and Keeper's labored breathing. The dog lay at the base of the third stone, his massive body already beginning to fade, becoming translucent, becoming part of the seal itself. Thomas knelt beside him, cradling Keeper's head, whispering apologies and gratitude and love. Keeper looked at him one final time, and Thomas saw in those eyes complete peace, complete acceptance, complete loyalty extending beyond death itself. Then Keeper was gone, not dead in the conventional sense, but transformed, his essence woven into the seal, his loyalty and courage and love becoming the foundation of the barrier that would hold the entity for eternity. The third stone glowed faintly with a light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Keeper's heartbeat. The dog was still there, still watching, still protecting, even in death. Thomas remained in the chamber until dawn, grieving for his friend, grateful for the sacrifice, and finally understanding what it meant to love something more than your own life. Then he climbed the stairs, sealed the entrance behind him, and emerged into the manor to find Mrs. Holloway waiting with questions in her eyes. He told her it was done. The entity was sealed. Hollow Hill was safe. But the cost had been Keeper, the most loyal and brave creature Thomas had ever known. Mrs. Holloway crossed herself and said that God would surely honor such a sacrifice, that Keeper's soul would find peace. Thomas wanted to believe it. He tried to return to his life, to manage the estate, to correspond with scholars about other matters. But without Keeper, the manor felt empty despite being safe. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, the strange sounds silenced, but the absence of his companion was a constant ache. He lasted a week. Then, on October 30th, 1 year to the day since he'd first met Keeper on the moors, Thomas made a decision. He would go into the chamber, one final time, would sit with the third stone where Keeper's essence resided, would keep his friend company even if only for a night. He descended the stairs as dusk fell, carrying a lantern and a blanket. He entered the chamber and saw that the seals were holding perfectly, the 7 stones standing strong, the pit quiet and sealed. The third stone still glowed faintly. Thomas sat beside it, placed his hand on its surface, and felt warmth, Keeper's warmth. He began to talk, telling Keeper about the week since the sealing, about the village's gratitude, though they didn't know the truth, about how much Thomas missed him. He talked for hours, the words flowing like confession, like prayer, like the conversation between old friends. And then something emerged from the darkness of the chamber, not from the pit, the seal held firm, but from the shadows themselves, as if passing through from some other realm. It was Keeper, not solid, not quite real, but present in a way that made Thomas's heart soar. The dog's shade approached, transparent and glowing with the same faint light as the stone, and sat beside Thomas as he had in life. Thomas reached out, and though his hand passed through the shade, he felt something, a warmth, a presence, a confirmation that Keeper wasn't truly gone, that his essence remained, still watching, still protecting, still loyal beyond death. Thomas wept with joy and grief intermingled, and he promised Keeper that he would visit often, would never forget the sacrifice, would ensure that Hollow Hill remained safe. The shade remained for an hour, sitting in companionable silence, before fading back into the shadows. Thomas returned to the surface feeling, for the first time since the sealing, at peace. He visited the chamber regularly after that, always at dusk on the 30th of each month, always bringing news of the village and the manor, always spending time with the stone that held Keeper's essence. Sometimes the shade appeared, sometimes Thomas simply felt Keeper's presence. Either way, the visit sustained him, reminded him why the sacrifice had been necessary, helped him bear the loneliness. But Thomas had underestimated the entity's cunning and patience. It had been sealed, yes, but not destroyed. And it had centuries to work, centuries to find weaknesses, centuries to influence the world above through the smallest cracks in the barrier. It began slowly, so slowly Thomas almost didn't notice. Dreams that were slightly too vivid, thoughts that didn't quite feel like his own, a growing obsession with the chamber, with visiting more frequently, with spending longer periods near the sealed pit. The entity was using his grief, his connection to Keeper, to draw him down into the chamber again and again, and each visit weakened him slightly, made him more susceptible to influence, brought him closer to doing what the entity wanted. It wanted Thomas to break the seal, to free Keeper's essence, to remove the third stone in a misguided attempt to save his friend. The entity whispered to him in dreams that Keeper was suffering, was trapped, was in pain. It showed him visions of the dog crying out for help. It planted thoughts suggesting that love meant freeing Keeper, not leaving him bound to the stone. Thomas, worn down by grief and loneliness, began to believe the whispers. He began to plan how he might break the seal, how he might free Keeper and find some other way to contain the entity. It was madness, of course. The grimoire had been clear. Breaking the seal would free the entity immediately. There was no other way to contain it. But grief had made Thomas vulnerable to the entity's manipulation. On October 30th, 1847, exactly 1 year after Keeper's sacrifice, Thomas descended to the chamber with tools to break the third stone. He'd told himself he was saving Keeper, that he'd find another solution for the entity, that love justified what he was about to do. He didn't notice how these thoughts didn't quite sound like his own voice. He didn't recognize the entity's influence because it had been so gradual, so subtle. He placed his chisel against the third stone, prepared to strike, prepared to shatter the seal and free Keeper's essence. And then Keeper's shade appeared, more solid than Thomas had ever seen it. And the dog did something that saved Thomas's life and sanity. Keeper bit him, not hard enough to cause real damage, but hard enough to shock Thomas out of his trance, to break the entity's hold on his mind. Thomas dropped the chisel and stared at the shade, finally seeing clearly. Keeper didn't want to be freed. Keeper was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he'd been meant to do. The whispers, the Drea, the visions of suffering, all lies from the entity trying to use Thomas's love as a weapon against the seal. Thomas wept and apologized and thanked Keeper for saving him again, even in death. The shade pressed against him, offering comfort and forgiveness. Then it did something Thomas would never forget. The shade moved to the pit, positioned itself between Thomas and the darkness, and growled the way it had in life when facing danger. The message was clear. I am still protecting you. I am still on guard. Go now and do not return. This is my post, and I will not abandon it. Thomas understood. His visits were endangering the seal, making him vulnerable to the entity's manipulation. If he truly loved Keeper, if he truly honored the sacrifice, he needed to leave the chamber and never return. He needed to let Keeper do his duty without interference. The hardest thing to do would be to say goodbye forever. But love sometimes means letting go. Thomas placed his hand one final time on the third stone, felt Keeper's warmth, whispered his gratitude and farewell. Then he left the chamber, sealed the entrance with additional iron plates, and buried the key to the cellar in a location he swore never to reveal. He lived the rest of his life at Ashford Manor, a good landlord and respected member of the community. But he never descended to the chamber again. He never spoke of what had happened, never revealed the truth about Hollow Hill, or the sacrifice that kept it safe. The secret died with him 40 years later, and the manor passed to distant cousins who knew nothing of its history. But on certain nights, particularly October 30th, people in Hollow Hill reported seeing a black dog patrolling the grounds of Ashford Manor, sitting sentinel at the gates, watching over the village with glowing eyes. The sightings became so common that the dog became part of local legend, a protective spirit, the Watchful Hound of Hollow Hill. and beneath the manor, in a sealed chamber no living person could access, Keeper remained on guard. The entity was trapped, the seal was strong, and the faithful hound who'd given everything to protect the innocent stood eternal watch over the darkness, ensuring it would never break free. That was the story as it stood for 70 years, until October 30th, 1917, when Thomas's great-great-nephew, a young man named Edmund who'd inherited the manor, discovered his ancestors' journal and learned the truth about what lay beneath Hollow Hill. The Guardian's Call. Edmund Ashford was 22 years old, freshly returned from the trenches of France and carrying wounds both visible and invisible. The Great War had taken his two older brothers, killed most of his school friends, and shattered any illusions he'd had about honor and glory. He'd inherited Ashford Manor not through any ambition but through the simple mathematics of survival. He was the last of the line, the only one left to carry a name that suddenly felt more like a burden than a privilege. He arrived at Hollow Hill in the autumn of 1917, much as Thomas had 70 years before, traveling by motorcar through countryside that seemed untouched by the industrial horror he'd left behind. The village was smaller than he remembered from childhood visits, diminished by the war that had claimed so many of its young men. The manor itself looked different too, somehow, as if the intervening decades had worn it down. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Davies who'd worked at the manor for 30 years, met him at the door with the news that the house had been experiencing troubles again. Doors that wouldn't stay closed, cold spots in summer rooms, sounds from the cellar that the groundskeeper refused to investigate. Edmund, who'd seen men blown apart by artillery and heard the screams of the dying in no man's land, found it difficult to be frightened by ghost stories. He told Mrs. Davies he'd look into it when he was settled. That night, alone in the master's bedroom, Edmund couldn't sleep. His wounds ached, and his mind replayed scenes from the war in vivid detail. To distract himself, he explored the room, examining its furnishings, opening drawers and cabinets he'd never been allowed to touch as a child. In a locked drawer of the writing desk, he found a journal, leather-bound and old, written in his great-great-uncle Thomas's hand. He read it by candlelight, and with each page his understanding of his family's history transformed. Thomas had documented everything: the discovery of the sealed chamber, the entity beneath the hill, the devil's bargain his great-grandfather had made, and most importantly, Keeper's sacrifice and the sealing ritual that had saved Hollow Hill. Edmund read the final entry 3 times. "If you are reading this, you are my heir, and you carry the burden of our family's sins. Beneath this manor sleeps an ancient evil, sealed by the sacrifice of the most loyal creature I have ever known. The seal will hold for centuries if left undisturbed, but you must never break it, never seek to free what lies below. Never let grief or greed tempt you as it tempted my grandfather. Keeper stands eternal watch over the darkness. Honor his sacrifice by leaving him to his duty. The sealed chamber must remain sealed. This is your sacred trust. Fail in this, and Hollow Hill will pay the price of our family's folly." Edmund felt cold fear that had nothing to do with the war. The troubles Mrs. Davies had mentioned, were they signs that the seal was weakening? Was the entity beginning to break free after 70 years? Thomas had written that the seal would hold for centuries, but perhaps he'd been wrong. Perhaps Keeper's sacrifice, however noble, wasn't sufficient for eternity. Edmund had to know. He had to see the chamber, assess the seal's condition, understand what he was dealing with. Against Thomas's explicit instructions, against his own better judgment, Edmund decided to descend. Finding the entrance took 2 days. Thomas had sealed it well and deliberately obscured its location. But Edmund was persistent, and he had Thomas's journal as a guide. He found the cellar entrance behind a false wall, protected by iron plates covered in symbols that made his eyes hurt to look at directly. The plates were warm to the touch despite the autumn chill, almost as if something on the other side was generating heat. Edmund gathered tools, a lantern, and the iron poker from the study fireplace, telling himself that he'd just look, just assess, just make sure everything was secure. Mrs. Davies tried to stop him, her face white with fear, saying that the previous groundskeeper had tried to open that door 15 years ago and had emerged screaming, refusing to ever speak of what he'd seen. But Edmund had faced German artillery. How bad could one sealed chamber be? He broke through the iron plates on October 28th, 2 days before the anniversary of Keeper's sacrifice. The door opened easily once the plates were removed, as if it had been waiting. The stairs beyond descended into darkness so complete his lantern seemed inadequate. The air that emerged was cold and carried a smell Edmund recognized from the war, the smell of death and rot and things that should stay buried. He descended anyway, drawn by duty and curiosity and the certainty that if there was a threat to Hollow Hill, he needed to understand it. He'd failed to protect his brothers in the war. He wouldn't fail to protect this village from his family's legacy. The stairs seemed longer than Thomas's journal had suggested, spiraling down through chambers carved with symbols that predated any language Edmund knew. Some chambers contained more than symbols. They contained warnings written in Latin and Old English, desperate messages carved by people who'd understood what lurked below. Turn back, seal the way, it lies, death waits below. Edmund continued down. He reached the sealing chamber just as his lantern began to flicker, its oil running low. The cavern was exactly as Thomas had described, 7 standing stones surrounding a central pit, symbols covering every surface, and a palpable sense of wrongness that made Edmund's skin crawl. But something was different from Thomas's account. The third stone, the one that held Keeper's essence, was cracked. Not broken, not fallen, but definitely damaged. A fissure ran from its base to its crown, and from that crack came a faint red glow. Edom! Und approached the stone carefully, extending his hand to touch it. The moment his fingers made contact, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. A growl, deep and warning, coming from everywhere and nowhere. And then he saw it, a shape emerging from the shadows, massive and black, with eyes that glowed with the same red light as the crack in the stone. It was Keeper, but not the loyal guardian Thomas had described. This was something twisted, something corrupted. The shade had been transformed by 70 years of constant battle with the entity, twisted by proximity to the darkness it guarded. Keeper's essence was still there, still trying to protect, but it had been warped into something that barely resembled a dog anymore. The corrupted shade lunged at Edmund, not to attack but to drive him away, to force him back up the stairs. Edmund stumbled backward, tripped, fell. His lantern shattered, plunging the chamber into darkness broken only by the red glow from the cracked stone and the corrupted shade's eyes. And from the pit came laughter. The entity, sensing Edmund's presence, sensing the fear of Thomas's descendant, began to speak. Its voice was like stones grinding together, like the earth itself forming words. Ashford blood. Finally. I have waited so long. The hound weakens, the seal crumbles. Soon I will be free, and Hollow Hill will be the first of many to fall. But you could prevent that. You could save your village. All you need to do is what your ancestors should have done 70 years ago. Break the third seal, free the suffering creature bound there, and let me provide you with a new seal. A stronger seal. A seal that won't corrupt and fail. All I is. K in return is 7 years of service. A small price for saving thousands of lives. Edmund, terrified and disoriented in the darkness, almost believed it. The entity's voice carried compulsion, carried weight, carried a terrible reasonableness. It was right that Keeper was suffering. It was right that the seal was failing. It was reasonable to want a better solution. 7 years of service seemed a small price for saving Hollow Hill. But then Edmund remembered the trenches. He remembered officers who'd sent thousands of men to their deaths with reasonable-sounding orders. He remembered propaganda that had promised glory and delivered only mud and blood. He remembered how evil always presented itself as reasonable, as necessary, as the lesser of two evils. Edmund said no. He said he wouldn't free the entity, wouldn't break the seal, wouldn't repeat his great-great-grandfather's mistake. The entity roared with rage, and the corrupted shade of Keeper suddenly changed. The red glow faded from its eyes, replaced by brown. The twisted shape became recognizable as a dog again. For just a moment, Edmund saw Keeper as he'd been, loyal, protective, faithful. The shade moved between Edmund and the pit, growling at the entity, defending Thomas's descendant the way he defended Thomas himself. The entity struck back, tendrils of darkness lashing out, trying to destroy the shade completely, but Keeper held. And in that moment of courage, Edmund understood what he needed to do. He couldn't repair the seal. He didn't have Thomas's knowledge or preparation, but he could strengthen it, could give Keeper the support he needed to continue his vigil. Edmund cut his palm with a piece of broken lantern, let his blood, Ashford blood, the blood of the family that had broken the seal, drip onto the cracked stone. And he spoke words he didn't know he knew, words that came from some ancestral memory, words of binding and strengthening and gratitude. The third stone's crack began to close, the red glow faded, and Keeper's shade, no longer corrupted, no longer twisted, looked at Edmund with recognition and approval. The entity screamed in rage, but the seal held, stronger now than it had been in decades. Edmund fled the chamber, running up the stairs in complete darkness, pursued by the entity's curses and promises of vengeance. He emerged into the cellar, sealed the entrance behind him, and collapsed, gasping and terrified but alive. Mrs. Davies found him hours later, helped him to his room, tended his wounds, and listened to his story. She wasn't surprised. She'd known there was something beneath the manor, had known for years. She said the village had always known, had always been grateful to the Ashford family for keeping it sealed, even if most people had forgotten why. Edmund made her promise to help him ensure the seal remained intact. She agreed, and together they created a system of checks, monitoring the cellar door weekly for signs of disturbance, watching for the symptoms Thomas had described: unusual sounds, cold spots, servants fleeing. For 3 years, everything remained quiet. Then, in the autumn of 1920, the troubles began again. Not slowly this time, but suddenly and violently. Windows shattered in the night. Fires started spontaneously. The smell of rot pervaded the manor, and from the cellar came sounds like something massive throwing its LF against a barrier, trying to break through. Edmund knew what it meant. His blood had strengthened the seal temporarily, but it wasn't enough. The entity was trying a new approach, attacking the barrier with all its strength, trying to break through before Edmund could reinforce it again. He had perhaps days before the seal failed completely. He needed help, but who could he turn to? Who would believe him? The war had made people skeptical of anything that smelled of propaganda or superstition. The church had been discredited in many people's eyes by priests who'd blessed weapons and called the war holy. Scientists would laugh at him. Scholars would think him mad. Then Edmund remembered something from Thomas's journal. Thomas had corresponded with antiquarians and folklorists, had built a network of people who studied the strange and supernatural. Perhaps some of those organizations still existed. Perhaps there were people who would believe him and could help. He spent 2 frantic days writing letters to universities, to occult societies, to anyone who might have knowledge of sealing rituals and ancient evils. He sent telegrams marked urgent. He begged for help. And then he waited, listening to the sounds from below grow louder, watching cracks appear in the cellar walls, feeling the manor itself begin to shake. Help arrived on October 29th, 1 day before the anniversary of Keeper's sacrifice. 3 people came: a professor of antiquities from Oxford named Dr. Sarah Blackwood, a priest who specialized in exorcisms named Father Thomas Byrne, and a woman who introduced herself simply as Morgan and claimed to be a practitioner of the old ways, a witch in the traditio nal sense. They were an unlikely group, barely tolerating each other's presence, but they'd all responded to Edmund's desperate letters because they'd each encountered evidence that creatures like the entity beneath Hollow Hill were real. They'd come to help, to study, and to prevent a catastrophe. Edmund showed them Thomas's journal and took them to the cellar door. They could all feel the wrongness emanating from below, could hear the sounds of something massive and angry trying to break free. Dr. Blackwood examined the door symbols and pronounced them a variation of Celtic binding patterns, overlaid with Christian additions from medieval monks. Father Byrne blessed the door with holy water and prayers. Morgan traced protective symbols in the air with her hands. But all 3 agreed the seal was failing. If they didn't act tonight, the entity would break free. And once free, it would be nearly impossible to contain. They had one chance to repair the seal properly, to give Keeper the strength he needed to hold for another century or more. But it would require everything Edmund had learned from Thomas's journal, everything the 3 experts could contribute, and a level of courage Edmund wasn't sure he possessed. They descended together at midnight on October 30th, armed with everything they could think of: iron, salt, blessed water, ancient texts, protective talismans, and determination. The stairs seemed longer than Edmund remembered, and the temperature dropped with each step until their breath came out in frozen clouds. The ceiling chamber was in chaos. The third stone was cracked again, worse than before, barely holding together. The other 6 stones were king, their foundations weakening. And the pit was no longer dark. It glowed with a sickly green light, and things moved within it, things that hurt to look at, things that shouldn't exist in a sane universe. Keeper's Shade was there, fighting with a ferocity that made Edmund's heart break. The dog was holding back tentacles and claws and worse things, sacrificing pieces of his own essence with each attack, burning himself away to give them time. He was dying, truly dying this time, his eternal watch coming to an end. Dr. Blackwood began reading from her texts, words in ancient Celtic that made the chamber ring like a bell. Father Byrne followed with Latin prayers, calling on saints and angels. Morgan traced symbols in the air with burning sage, weaving protection around them. And Edmund, following Thomas's journal, began to prepare the ritual that would repair the third stone. The entity fought back with everything it had. The tentacles that Keeper was holding multiplied, trying to reach the humans, to stop the ritual. The temperature dropped further until Edmund's fingers were numb and barely functional. Whispers filled the air, promises and threats and lies designed to break their concentration. But they continued. Dr. Blackwood's voice never wavered. Father Byrne prayed with absolute faith. Morgan's symbols grew brighter and stronger. And Edmund, cutting his palm deeper, letting more blood flow onto the stone, spoke the words of binding. Keeper's Shade grew stronger as the ritual progressed. The dog's form became more solid, more real, as if the combined efforts of the 4 humans were channeling power to him. He stopped merely defending and went on the attack, driving the entity's manifestations back toward the pit. The entity realized it was losing. With a scream that shook the entire hill, it made one final desperate attempt. Every tentacle, every manifestation, every ounce of its power focused on one goal: killing Edmund before he could complete the ritual. If Edmund died, the ritual would fail, and the seal would break. The attack came from behind, from Edmund's blind spot. He never saw it coming, but Keeper did. The shade launched itself between Edmund and the entity's attack, taking the full force of the strike. The entity's power tore through Keeper's essence, should have destroyed him completely, should have ended his eternal watch. But something impossible happened. As Keeper's shade began to dissolve, the combined faith and power of the 4 humans poured into him. Dr. Blackwood's scholarly knowledge, Father Byrne's religious conviction, Morgan's ancient magic, and Edmund's Ashford blood, all of it flowed through the ritual into Keeper, transforming him. The shade became solid, not ghostly anymore, but real, flesh and bone and fur, manifesting in the physical world as he'd been 70 years ago. Keeper, restored to life, stood between them and the entity with strength renewed and multiplied. The dog howled, a sound of triumph and rage and absolute defiance. Then he attacked the entity with power no mere dog should possess. His jaws closed on tendrils and tore them apart. His claws raked across manifestations and dispersed them. He drove the entity back into the pit with the fury of 70 years of battle concentrated into one assault. Edmund completed the ritual. The third stone's cracked seal. Completely. The 7 stones began to glow with a pure white light, bright enough to drive back the entity's sickly green. The seal strengthened, reinforced not just by Keeper's sacrifice but by the willing participation of 4 humans who'd chosen to stand against darkness. The entity's screams faded, its manifestations withdrew into the pit. The green light died, replaced by the white glow of the completed seal, and Keeper, no longer a shade but a living dog once more, sat at the base of the third stone and looked at Edmund with eyes full of intelligence and peace. Dr. Blackwood said what they'd just witnessed was impossible, that shades couldn't be restored to life, that the dead didn't return. But she was looking at Keeper with wonder anyway. Father Byrne said it was a miracle, God's reward for the dog's faithful service. Morgan said it was the old magic, the power of loyalty and sacrifice recognized by forces older than Christianity. Edmund didn't care about the explanation. He knelt beside Keeper and embraced the dog, grateful beyond words. Keeper was alive, warm, real, and the seal was stronger than ever, reinforced by 4 people's combined efforts, protected by a guardian who'd been rewarded for his eternal service. They climbed back to the surface as dawn broke on October 31st. Edmund sealed the cellar entrance, this time with the help of his 3 companions. Dr. Blackwood inscribed new protective symbols based on her research. Father Byrne blessed it with prayers and holy water. Morgan added protections from the old traditions. Together they created a barrier that would last for centuries, that would prevent anyone from disturbing the seal again. Keep R remained at Edmund's side, now his dog in the conventional sense, but with an intelligence and purpose that marked him as something more. The dog had been released from his eternal watch by the seal's reinforcement, but he'd chosen to stay, to remain guardian of Hollow Hill not because he was bound but because he wanted to. The 4 humans parted ways the next day, promising to stay in contact, to monitor other sites where ancient evils might be sealed, to act as a network that could respond to similar crises. Edmund gave them copies of Thomas's journal, asked them to spread the knowledge, to help prevent other families from making the mistakes his ancestors had made. Edmund lived the rest of his life at Ashford Manor with Keeper at his side. He married, had children, and told them the truth about their family's history and their responsibility to Hollow Hill. He taught them to respect the seal, to honor Keeper's sacrifice, to understand that some evils can only be contained, not destroyed, and that eternal vigilance is the price of safety. Keeper lived for 25 more years, far longer than any natural dog, and when he finally died peacefully in his sleep in 1942, Edmund buried him on the hill with a marker that read, "Keeper, guardian of Hollow Hill, loyal beyond death, friend beyond measure." The entire village attended the funeral, even though most of them didn't know the full truth. They knew only that Keeper had been special, that he'd protected them, that he deserved honor. But the story doesn't end with Keeper's death, because on certain nights, particularly October 30th, people in Hollow Hill still report seeing a large black dog patrolling the grounds of Ashford Manor. The sightings are too consistent to be imagination, too detailed to be folklore. The Watchful Hound of Hollow Hill continues his vigil, even after death, even after being released from his duty. Some say it's Keeper's spirit, unable to fully rest while the entity beneath the hill remains sealed. Others say it's a new guardian, sent by whatever power created the first Keeper, ensuring that Hollow Hill always has a protector. Edmund's descendants believe it's both, Keeper's spirit and a new guardian, working together across the boundary between life and death. The seal remains strong, the entity stays trapped, and Hollow Hill prospers under the watchful eye of its guardian. The manor still stands, occupied by Edmund's great-grandchildren, who maintain the traditions he established. Every October 30th, the family descends to the cellar door, confirms the seal is intact, and leaves an offering of gratitude, a bowl of water and a bone, tokens of respect for the hound who gave everything to protect them. The story of Keeper has been told and retold through generations, each telling emphasizing different lessons. To some, it's a story about loyalty that transcends death. To others, it's a warning about the consequences of greed and the importance of honoring ancient wisdom. To the children of Hollow Hill, it's a bedtime story about a brave dog who fought monsters and won. But the deepest truth of the story is this: love is the strongest magic. Thomas's love for Keeper gave the seal its foundation. Edmund's gratitude strengthened it. The combined faith of 4 strangers restored a fallen guardian to life. And Keeper's love for those he protected made him willing to sacrifice everything, not once but repeatedly, across 70 years of eternal watch. That love still guards Hollow Hill. That love still keeps the darkness at bay. That love still manifests as a black dog with glowing eyes, watching over the village, protecting the innocent, standing between the world and ancient evil. The Watchful Hound of Hollow Hill is not just a story, it's a promise that loyalty will be rewarded, that sacrifice will be honored, that evil will be opposed, and that love, in all its forms, is more powerful than darkness. On quiet nights in Hollow Hill, when the wind howls across the moors and the stars shine bright over Yorkshire, If you listen carefully, you can hear a sound that makes the villagers smile. It's the sound of a dog's howl, clear and strong, a guardian's call that says, "I am here. I am watching. You are safe." And Hollow Hill sleeps peacefully, protected by its faithful hound, guarded by a love that death could not break and time cannot diminish. The entity beneath the hill may rage against its prison, may test its bonds, may wait with the patience of eons for a chance to break free. But it will wait forever, because Keeper stands watch, and a loyal dog never abandons his post. That is the tale of the Watchful Hound of Hollow Hill, a story of horror and hope, of sacrifice and salvation, of an ancient evil and an eternal guardian. It's a story that reminds us that the greatest strength is found not in power or knowledge, but in loyalty, and the willingness to stand against darkness no matter the cost. Edmund Ashford lived to be 83, long enough to see his great-grandchildren born, long enough to know that Hollow Hill would be protected for generations to come. On his deathbed in 1978, he was asked if he had any regrets about inheriting the manor, about learning the truth, about descending to that chamber despite Thomas's warnings. He said no. He said the burden had also been a privilege. He said that knowing evil existed meant knowing that good could triumph. He said that meeting Keeper, witnessing his loyalty, participating in his restoration, those experiences had given his life meaning that nothing else could match. His final words were,